Hi and welcome to Boston Media Theory. My name's Marcus Breen and this is a program where we talk about people who work and live in Boston who are researchers and have an interest in the areas of media and communication and of course the area of theory. And so today, continuing our series, I'm delighted to welcome a colleague of mine from Boston College, Matt Sienkiewicz, and we're going to talk about a range of issues to do primarily I think with media and with the field of what's generally, maybe generically referred to as media studies.
Sure.
And I think everybody's pretty clear about the fact that media is a massive field of endeavour.
Mm-hmm.
Historically, it's been something that has attracted a lot of attention. It's generated great many moral panics and continues to do so. And it's also a wonderful tool for thinking about how we relate to each other and to the world, and for the potential that is within it for what we might think of as emancipation, for how people can get ideas whereby they can gain their freedom. So your interest is really seems to operate across a broad range of areas, Matt.
Yeah, I think I'm not going to say I'm unique, but a little bit unusual in the breadth of interest that I take. And that doesn't say so much about me. It says more about kind of the modern academy. There's a real temptation, if you want to be a professor, if you want to be a professional researcher, to really focus in on one single area. I've resisted that a little bit. I mean, I have some concentrations and I have stuff that I've worked on more than others, but I am interested in a wide gamut of media issues. So I've written and researched and taught about things across different media, television, film, the internet. I've done domestic work and I've done a lot of international work. So I have a fairly wide range of topics that I've dealt with in my career.
It is interesting, in some ways a challenge to get your head around the variety and the range of potential areas for research.
Yeah.
In media, and the field of media theory is huge, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, the word media, right? This is a plural of medium, right? It's everywhere, right? I mean, any act of communication that has something between it is in the field of media studies.
Right.
So if it's not a face-to-face interaction and it's some form of communication, this is media theory is applicable, media research is applicable, and it is a field that is always coming up with something new and interesting to look at. As opposed to digging up stuff from the past, we're often encountering brand new things that we need to incorporate into our ideas.
Right. Well, I'll take up that point before we go back a little to talk about your history and life in Boston, as it were. And the fact of the matter is that we also have to deal with the fact that because there are so many pressing issues that emerge in media, sometimes it's difficult, at least from my perspective, to know, what aspects of our work is fashion orientated.
Yeah.
It's contingent on what's happening today, and we need to have an answer to it. And then what is more informed by the longer trajectories of the acquisition of knowledge and critical thinking.
Yeah, this is a big challenge when it comes to media studies, as opposed to if you're studying medieval poetry or something.
Yeah, right.
Right. There is not only an interest and an excitement in studying new things, but insofar as scholarship can be important, it's important to study new things and to incorporate it. That said, you don't have the advantage of critical distance. You are often, it's like Marshall McLuhan said, we don't know who discovered water, but it wasn't the fish. Yeah. Right? If you're surrounded by something, then it's often difficult to really get a good critical perspective on it. That said, there is such a tendency in popular discourse to attribute cause and effect to media, to make fairly reductive pronouncements about what, for example, how video games make people violent, or this media turns people conservative, or these sorts of things. They're being bandied about so much that those of us who do have some critical ideas about this really, I think, have an obligation to interject and try to talk about contemporary topics, even without the benefit of hindsight.
Yeah, that's true. And we also have the potential advantage, if you like, of usually, and this program will be a case in point, of having some confidence about using the media itself, of being in the media and seeing, this show as a form of research to all intents and purposes.
Absolutely.
And the kind of broad discourse that's available within media studies is indeed broad and quite exceptional.
Yeah, absolutely. No, there's no question.
Yeah. So as I said, we'll talk a little bit about your experience of living in Boston. You were telling me earlier that you grew up in Boston.
I do, in the area.
Yeah, so the question that I think is maybe instructive is your own sense of where media studies fits in Boston, your experience of it.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting. Of course, it's sort of inside baseball
so
to a
do I,
certain
yeah.
extent. Media studies, I think, is interesting in Boston. So I grew up in Medfield, Massachusetts, which is not too far from here. And I just ended up back in Boston to teach at Boston College by chance. For those of you who are not familiar with the economics of the academy, you don't have often many choices as to where you're going to live. You apply for jobs, you see what comes up. I happen, very fortunately, I'm very thankful for it, to have gotten a job back near my home in a city that I love. Right. So that's how I ended up in Boston College. Now you ask about media studies here. It's an interesting thing. Sure. So media studies is often, as you know, grouped into the broader discipline of communication. And what is unique about Boston is this is a city with obviously tremendous educational and scholarly institutions. But the big ones, particularly Harvard and MIT, have not historically really done communication research. They've moved towards it more recently. But there is no communication department at Harvard, for example. Right. And MIT has a comparative media studies program, but it's not obviously the focus of an institution such as MIT. And so there are parts of sort of the Boston intellectual world which I think media studies is looked down on a little bit because it's not something that Harvard does. And if you're not Harvard, you're not really the Boston educational scene to a certain extent. That said, it gives an opportunity for other institutions like Boston College, Boston University, Northeastern to do some real interesting research, not in the shadow necessarily of that giant Ivy behemoth across the river. And so I think there's a lot of respect for media studies by and large, but there's still this little bit of suspicion that why are you looking at, let's say, popular culture texts? Why are you looking at sitcoms? Why are you writing about internet memes when you could be writing about Thomas Aquinas or something? I don't know.
I have to take up the point about MIT. It's something that I think is quite important to remind ourselves of, and perhaps viewers, that the liberal arts and humanities tradition was introduced into MIT at a certain point. I can't exactly recall the year, but it's instructive because it tells us something about how our field is seen within the broader field, right? So what you had is scientists inventing things like the atom bomb or contributing to the war machine or the military-industrial complex, as Eisenhower referred to it. And in a sense, there was no space in that campus for a discourse, critical or otherwise, around what was happening. And in a sense, introducing liberal arts, communication, literature, literary studies, and all sorts of good things related to really communication and media studies was a way to ameliorate some of the excesses of, we might call it the engineers who didn't really think about anything outside of the engineering equation. Sure. Yeah. So I think that's a unique part of Boston history too.
It absolutely is, yeah. I mean, there are a number of ways in which media studies can be sort of an object of suspicion. Yeah. There is, of course, as I mentioned, the sort of suspicion of popular culture, but as you put it too, there's this question of practicality. One thing about teaching in a communication department is some people think, oh, you're training people to be news anchors or something like this. It sounds very practical, but in fact, as you know, generally, no, we're critical. We're not to say that our students don't go on to do that sort of work, but our goal is to get them to be critical about that work when they do it, not just to do it in the way that the system points them to. And so media studies has this sort of in-between place, which I think is interesting.
It's not only interesting, it's valuable in the sense in which students who may not necessarily see the training for a job, as it were, professional training, in the way that media studies is structured, take what they learn with them as a set of skills that prepares them to engage more fully and more richly with what they're seeking to produce in the media scape, and I think that's very valuable.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think it's first and foremost valuable because we should be critical citizens, right? I mean, and if we're not, then we lose a lot of the richness of living life. Yeah. You can, if you want to, be a little bit economic about it. If you want to, and you can say that, employers do tend to say that people who are critical are better at doing their jobs. You can look at it that way also. So we have sort of, on the one hand, we're always on the defensive, because there's something a little bit suspicious about media studies. It doesn't have the ancient traditions of philosophy.
Right.
It doesn't have the practical, obvious connection of business. But we have this sort of double layer of both producing what we think are critical citizens and providing people sort of these general critical thinking skills that are actually really valued in the marketplace. We don't like to focus on that. I prefer to focus on the first part about creating critical citizens, but it's nice if people can get a job too.
Yeah, well, my little sort of flag to wave is that somebody I taught years ago was a producer on the David Letterman show for many years. And, you know, I sort of would watch that show sort of feeling quite happy with myself that it seemed that there was a connection between the kind of efforts and to be critical, the efforts to raise questions in that very popular level that, you know, were the result of the kinds of efforts that might have happened in the classroom many years before.
Absolutely right. You're not expecting people who go into corporate media to become radical, but you do hope that they can sort of have a little awareness of the history of the maybe you know the discourses that they're participating in, and make those little remarks in that media room. Say maybe we shouldn't represent this character this way. Maybe that has a history that we don't want to be involved in or something. Right? We're not asking for an anarcho-Marxist takeover of the media, but it is nice to move things maybe in a little bit in the right direction as media producers become a little bit more aware of the history that they operate in and the discourses that they operate in.
Sure. Professor Chomsky would prefer us to have an anarcho-syndicalist takeover. 100%. But that's one perspective and a very important perspective in Boston.
Yeah, absolutely, a crucial one. And one that I mean, it's worth noting that the way that media studies has developed is not in that in Professor Chomsky's sort of direction, as much as there are very valuable insights in his very often very persuasive arguments about the connection between the government, the military, and the media, sort of producing a certain set of consciousness. This is all very persuasive. He does not tend to give much credence. He does not tend to give much power to that consumer, to the viewer, to the person who can be a critical viewer. He sort of leaves you with the picture of a world in which no matter of critical engagement could ever improve things because the system is so rigged. And we want to keep that in mind, but there is something about it that makes you a little bit uncomfortable with this notion of the helpless consumer. I don't feel helpless when I watch TV. I don't feel like the messages are being beaten into me in a way that I can't resist. And I don't think I'm special because I'm not that way. And so that's an important perspective to balance with Noam Chomsky's ideas of sort of the structural dominance that's embedded within media.
Yeah. I also think that the way that our field, media and communication studies in particular, along with and informed by cultural studies, has emerged with a deep respect, if you like, for popular culture.
Absolutely.
For people's culture.
Yeah.
And so questions about elitism become real questions.
They do. Yeah. No,
because what are the people saying becomes a question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the, this is a fundamental insight of the tradition of media and cultural studies, right, is the idea that you can't just flip on whatever whatever TV show you want to beat up on, 2.5 Men, whatever it is, whatever's your thing that you want to sort of make as your representative of low culture. You can't watch it and know what each audience member is making of it. You can't, and when you do that, you're imposing yourself in a way that's not right. That doesn't mean to say we can't look for the messages in it and sort of start thinking about ways in which this might be influential. But there's a certain confidence to the approach that says, these messages are out there, and therefore people are going to act this way. Sort of a cause and effect thing, which is embedded in some of that critical theory that, as you note, cultural studies has kind of taken up against, right, and said that we don't know how people necessarily make meaning of it, and very often if we research it and we do some audience research, we realize people do not take things the way that the person who's watching it over at MIT or at Boston College think they are.
Yes, exactly. Well, we know about some of that interpretive work from Stuart Hall and the encoding and decoding material. I want to talk a little bit in the time we've got also about your specific work, the issues that you've been able to address as a scholar and across the breadth of your of the field. And I think it's instructive to see that You brought a couple of things along, and there's a wonderful book that you've got in production now, which I've read part of the manuscript of, which I think is fantastic, which we'll talk about. But also to use that as an opportunity to think about how broad and welcoming the field of media studies is, in terms of not only the interdisciplinary nature of it, draws on many different traditions, but also the contribution that we make, I think we would like to make to society, to the broad deliberations within democracy of how to achieve whatever the light on the hill might be.
Sure.
Yeah. So I wanted to maybe go back and you could hold these couple of things up. One is a video, so is it a documentary?
It is a documentary. This is a film I made while I was writing my dissertation at the University of Wisconsin.
Okay.
And it is in many ways sort of the foundation for that manuscript that you mentioned that I'm currently finishing up, hopefully. We'll see. There's a review process in process. I did work in media for a period of time after graduating from undergraduate.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
So yeah, I worked essentially for Vermont Public Television, for independent producers who contracted with Vermont Public Television. So I developed some skills in production, particularly documentary production. And so the Film Live from Bethlehem is about this Palestinian news organization called the Ma'an Network. And it's you might call it an ethnographic documentary. This is a station which is funded by the United States, which claims to be an independent voice in the Palestinian media sphere. And I don't, when I say claims, it sounds like I'm questioning it. I question the general notion of independence more than I question their particular claims to independence. And so this is a film about the interaction between American policy interests, American strategies in the Middle East, and local people actually doing the work in places like Bethlehem and Ramallah, and so on.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's talk about the book then. It's called The Other Air Force, America's Efforts to Reshape Middle Eastern Media Since 9/11. It could change, I guess. The title could change. Publisher might suggest something else. But I think it's a great title, The Other Air Force.
Yeah, I like the beginning. The second part will probably be whatever they tell me. Whatever's going to search best on Amazon.
Yeah, right. There's been a long-standing discussion in media studies in particular about what's called cultural imperialism, and then you refer to, in the manuscript and in the book, to media imperialism, and questions about how the US has sought to influence opinion and then determine policy outcomes through public opinion by using the media as a tool. The media is American. Famous book from the 1970s, I believe, by Tunstall. And that's now changed, so the media is no longer American. But in your case, you're saying that there is a significant change in the way that the US government and perhaps other forces with an interest in supporting the US ideologically are at work. Maybe you could explain that a little.
Yeah, so this is research based on field research, trips to the Middle East. I use, and I don't mean it to represent everything that happens in the region, but as sort of two poles or two spaces from two sides of the story. So I have research from the Palestinian territories, and then I went to Kabul, Afghanistan. I did some research there.
Not the safest places in the world to be doing research, Matt.
Not the safest, no. Not the safest, particularly Kabul. I showed up right when things really started heating up. I don't think it was as a result of my appearance. It was, as if you're following the news, things are they continue to be extremely tenuous at best.
Absolutely.
And so I went to these spaces, and what I was doing was following around, interviewing, observing institutions that are funded by the United States, but I argue are set up to have a certain level of distance, of what they will call independence. And so traditional media imperialist theory looks at sort of two major institutions. One is stuff like Voice of America. Where America, we produce the material ourselves. Sometimes we hire locals, but we supervise them. I'm going to use we for the United States here.
Sure.
It comes out that way, one way or the other. So there's things like Voice of America, which, if you go to the Middle East or Africa, or well, actually not the Middle East anymore, but if you go to Africa, you go to Europe, you'll hear American-produced radio, vetted by Washington, produced and sent over. That's one form of media imperialism, where you literally produce localized media, but with an American kind of editorial demand. There's also the form of media imperialism, which is more, let's get them to watch our shows of their own free choice. So let's sell them, in the 1980s, Dallas really inexpensively, and we'll use that to sort of get them to be interested in America and maybe look at America and think it's a modern, exciting place. Those are sort of the traditional forms. I'm arguing that what we're seeing now in places like Afghanistan and places like the Palestinian territories is something that sort of sits in the middle, where on the one hand we are producing and funding local media, but we're doing it in a way that gives a significant level of agency to those locals. So if you go to Kabul, Afghanistan, you'll find something called Tolo TV. It is wildly popular. It's particularly in Kabul, but also in some of the more rural regions. If you're to watch the shows, very few of them seem to have much in the way of American messaging, if any of them do. A few do. But for the most part, they're like reality TV shows, localized, so Pop Idol program or a version of The Voice or Minute to Win It. And you wouldn't see this as being something that is necessarily sort of a message-driven program. But if you follow the funding, you realize the station only exists because America has pumped money into it. Right? And so we're sort of offering a different approach, one that is supposed to have an influence in kind of a structural way, introducing the notion of commercial television and local entrepreneurship into these spaces, providing red lines. There's certain things they're not allowed to say, or we pull the funding back, right? There is no question, and in the Palestinian case, even stronger red lines are there. But at the same time, what I argue in this book is that our goal is not to send specific messages to Kabul. It's to create a system of competitive media. The notion that the type of media you should have should look like ours in your version of it, which is new. This is something that has not been, especially in sort of war zones. Traditionally, we've used much more top-down information messaging.
Yes. And the fascinating insight, I think, is that you offer these sort of subtleties, but end up with what you just said as your conclusion, which is really, this is a question of how the ideological apparatus really operates.
For sure.
And that is that what we're really doing here is producing or reproducing a particular style of capitalism.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And the structure of these media stations offers a way of doing capitalism.
It does, yeah, for sure. I mean, it's often a modified capitalism in a place. Well, there's a few ways in which that's the case. The Palestinian territories, the market is weak. The market is for media is very weak in terms of advertisements, and so the capitalism is often one that is more of a competing over grant money kind of thing, but it still functions capitalistically in sort of the logic of we have to show that we've got an audience that we're recording and this. So there's those sorts of things. You've got Afghanistan where it's much more commercially oriented, but the entire economy is sort of pumped up by American presence and American money. But I appreciate your comment about the subtlety. I'm trying to be subtle about something that people are often not that subtle about when it comes to America and the Middle East. So, if I need to sum it up, what I want to say here is that on the one hand, we should respect the local agency of these producers in Kabul and in Bethlehem who are, taking chances sometimes with their lives, if you want to be dramatic, but always with their careers, and are making interesting programming. And we shouldn't just write that off as a sort of pure act of dominance. At the same time, we need to look at the structure in which it exists, and that's that America pays for Afghans' media. It doesn't go the other way.
Right. So what would they do? Let's try a thought experiment. What would they do if some former members of the Afghani Communist Party wanted to do a program?
Yeah, no, this is not.
Wouldn't happen.
No. So you have what happened in Afghanistan after the invasion. Is
which one? The Russian,
the
American
Northern Alliance NATO invasion, which is sort of 2001. What happened in terms of media at that point was that So if you go back a little bit, in the 1980s, you had communist media supported by the Russians. You did have Taliban media in the turn of the millennium. Anybody who was involved with either of those was really marginalized when America came in and rebuilt the system. And so notions of being professional in Afghanistan meant not being somebody who was involved in the communist system.
Right.
And so the ways in which people who were media workers during the communist period have been sort of kind of pushed out is by saying they're unprofessional. By saying that the form of media that the Russians supported is not the kind of media that real media stations do. Real media stations do things that look a lot more like, Fox or NBC or
whatever.
Oh.
Yes. So, in some ways, it doesn't really reproduce the American system, where I suppose you could say that some radio stations would broadcast in the US would be reasonably tolerant of all opinions.
Well, I want to be clear. There are those stations in places like
okay,
Afghanistan.
okay.
We
Right.
just aren't supporting them.
Okay, gotcha.
So
That's a good point.
there are communist stations,
Yes.
there are warlord stations, there are
Oh, okay.
Iranian stations,
Right.
there are Pakistani stations. These all exist.
Right.
But in the America, and this is really part of what America wanted here. They didn't necessarily want the Iranian station, preaching anti-American stuff, but they wanted a competitive, vibrant market. The American station, though, you're not going to. They've gotten into some hot water by often voicing Taliban perspectives that the government would rather than not.
Yeah.
That's tolerated. Again, the messages aren't the issue. It's the structure.
Yeah.
America wants Tola TV in Afghanistan to operate like a for-profit company.
Yeah.
That's what really matters. The specific messages, unless they're really offensive, are not really what we're after.
Right. Well, it's a fantastic set of ideas associated with how the media works certainly in war zones.
Yeah.
Afghanistan, I think, generally is considered
it's a war
pretty
zone.
much a war
Yeah,
zone.
yeah, absolutely.
And the Palestine and the Palestinian territories are difficult.
Yeah, it's hard to.
environment.
Labels are very hard. No matter
Yeah,
what word you
yeah,
use, somebody will
yeah,
get mad.
yeah. But I have to say, in winding up, that the idea of engaging in research about these important fields is fantastic, in the sense in which it provides us with an understanding of what's happening.
I do my best.
On behalf not only of our own country, but the global nature of the media.
That's crucial to this, is that this is a global interaction. This is not an area studies project. This is not just, it's about this incredibly complicated military economic interaction between with the whole world involved, particularly sort of the US and the Middle East.
Okay, well, that's all for tonight, and thank you very much to Matt for your contribution to Boston Media Theory. I'm Marcus Breen, and until next time, see you later.